All right, and I believe we are going. All right, so everyone, I nearly lost my screen there for a sec. No worries. All right, so I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mr. David Dillon Thomas. He's the author of the book Design for Cognitive Bias from a Book Apart. He serves as content strategy advocate at an experienced design firm Think Company, and he's also the creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast. He's developed digital strategies for major clients in entertainment, healthcare, publishing, finance, and retail. He's been presented at TEDNYC, SXSW Interactive, Confab, Invent Apart, LavaCon, UX Copenhagen, Artifact, IA Conference, Design and Content Conference, and Wharton Web Conference on topics at the intersection of bias, design, and social justice. So today I'll be talking to us more on cognitive bias using mental shortcuts for web design, or for using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. So everyone, please give a warm welcome and round of applause for David Dillon Thomas.
Thank you. And I am realizing I have to find the controls to unmute myself because I'm holding down spacebar right now. Hold on just a sec. There we go. That's better. So here we go. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. Sorry, one more little tweak I got to make because this is in the wrong place. So welcome to Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. I'm David Dillon Thomas, as Rachel said. So I'm a content strategy advocate at Think Company, the experienced design firm I mentioned before. And I did write this book, Design for Cognitive Bias, which came out last August. And the road to this book began with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to this podcast began with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet. And she gave an amazing talk a while back called Gender Equality by Design. And in the talk, she points out that a lot of implicit racial and gender bias comes down to pattern recognition. And an example might be, let's say you're hiring a web developer. And when I say those words, web developer, the first image that might pop into your brain might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you actually think that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that might have been built up in your life from movies you've seen or television you've watched or offices maybe you've worked in might make that equation. And so if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that pattern, all of a sudden you're giving it the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could come down to something as simple and, dare I say, human as pattern recognition, I thought I needed to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here. And I took one look at this and I realized I am not going to figure this all out in a day. So I took just one a day, and then I'd move on to the next one. And this turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, it's worth establishing from the jump, what is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's just a fancy word for the shortcuts you're trying to take to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions a day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk, where to look, what to do with my hands. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that for the most part, our days are spent on autopilot. But sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And the way it works is, let's say you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a lower number, you tend to roll it really gently. And we all know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die, but in situations where we have no control, we like to feel like we have control. And so we embody that by how we roll the die. Now, this one's not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it plays out when you have an idea in your head and you really only look for evidence to confirm that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't confirm the idea, you yell fake news and you move on. Now, a really powerful example of this came during the Iraq War. The whole idea was we need to get in there because Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and we got to get him before he gets us. It was a very compelling argument. After about a year, the president of the United States announces, yeah, we didn't find anything. And this was the guy who insisted there was something there. Regardless, many people still believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So many that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats believed, yes, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I can guarantee you the impeachment proceedings that are going on right now, I guarantee you that 15 years from now, there will be many, many people who firmly believe that Donald Trump won the presidency. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it later. Now, these biases are very hard to fight. Part of the problem is you may not even realize you have the bias. There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot, where you think you don't have any biases, but you are sure everybody else does. Part of the difficulty seeing them is that about 95% of cognition is happening below the level of conscious thought, right? So you are making these decisions so quickly, you don't even necessarily realize you've made them. In fact, they've done research that indicates that, if I reach for this bottle of water, I think what happens is I think I'm thirsty and then my hand does a thing that I've told it to. But if you kind of measure the electrical impulses, my hand started reaching before I had the thought I want water. So we are making these decisions very quickly. In fact, the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Now, even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it. There's a bias called anchoring, and the way it works is I could ask everybody in this meetup to write down the last 2 numbers of their phone number. And then I could say, okay, we're gonna bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down a lower number, probably gonna bid lower. Those of you who wrote down a higher number, probably gonna bid higher. It's called anchoring, it's a thing. But here's the thing, I could tell you all of that before we did the experiment, I'd still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to do it. I'd still probably do it. Now, the reason we need to care about things like cognitive bias in the work that we do is because of a thing called choice architecture. And you can see it play out if you go try to buy some produce, right? Common wisdom is you never reach for the top of the stack, because that's where the grocer is going to put the product that they're most trying to move, right? The older produce. They have architected that situation to benefit them. Now, they could just as easily architect it to benefit the customer and put the freshest fruit where it is easiest to reach. The point is, no matter how they architect the situation, it is going to impact the decisions that the person experiencing that architecture is going to make. Now, think about the decisions your user needs to make. And then think about how people make decisions, not how we think they make decisions like rational human beings. No, how people who make decisions, who are making most of those decisions below the threshold of conscious thought, make decisions, right? And it turns out that there are content and design choices that we can make to help keep some of those biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So let's go back to that skinny white guy. Right now, as it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have 2 identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a male sounding name, it tends to move up the chain. If it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay on the pile. Now, here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision are things like the qualifications or the experience. The thing that might actually be getting in the way, depending on what patterns you've grown up with, might be the gender or the race, or really what you're reading into the name in terms of the gender or the race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position, and they learned a couple things pretty quickly. One, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, is to physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. The other thing they found out is that as soon as they found a resume they liked, their next instinct would be to go to GitHub to see the portfolio, basically, of that web developer. Problem is, guess what happens the second that they go to that GitHub profile? They see all the personal information, and it ruins the experiment. So clever people that they are, they created a Chrome plugin that would anonymize all of that information as the page loaded. And just to complete the circle, they took that code and put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. Now, this isn't just about helping humans make hiring decisions. Amazon had a hiring bot that was basically there to help them sift through resumes. And what they found is that it was extremely sexist. So sexist that if it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. And when they tried to figure out how it became so sexist, they looked at the training data. and they trained it on the last 10 years of resumes to Amazon. Guess what most of those resumes had in common? It's mostly guys. And the AI took one look at that and said, gee, you sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. Now, we kind of have this inflated sense of AI that it's this super objective, cold, rational Spock-like figure, when in fact it is a glorified prediction engine. And if you point AI at a racist, sexist world, it will make racist, sexist predictions. We might even want to consider, lying to AI just to get more objective results. Now, this works in the reverse as well. So Amazon Go is a store where you may even have some of these where you live, where you just go in, get what you want, and you leave. And basically, Amazon will automatically deduct whatever you've taken from your account. Now, for Ashley Clark Thompson, this had a curious effect. She wrote an article for CNET that said, "Am Amazon Go and no one thinks I'm stealing?" And what she's referring to is a phenomenon known as shopping while black. And the way it works is it's kind of like hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? She didn't experience this because there was no staff there to make her feel that way, right? By removing one key design element, namely the staff, Amazon actually created a less biased experience for this customer. And we can even say this play out in the judicial system. And anyone living in the Bay Area, I'm curious if you've heard any progress on this, because this is about a year old. San Francisco DA. So first off, just for context, district attorneys have incredible leeway when it comes to deciding whether or not to actually bring charges when a crime has been committed. And perhaps not surprisingly, when the offender is black, they're more likely to bring charges than if the offender is white for the same crime. So not unlike the resumes, the San Francisco DA's office said, well, why do we need that information to make the decision, right? Just tell us what the crime is. And so they created a program to remove the race and gender of the offender, the race and gender of the victim, and even the location of the crime from the crime report the DA was using to decide whether or not to bring charges. I only know about the beginning of this experiment, and every time I'm in the Bay Area, I'm like, hey, anybody heard anything about this? So if anyone has heard anything about this, let me know. I'm really curious to see if this worked. Another really important concept to get our heads around is called cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I will assume whatever it's talking about is going to be easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's going to be hard to do. Now, I have been making a lot of pancakes lately. This is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small, kind of clumped together. And I glance at that and I think, but pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm gonna make pancakes. Now I take that same text and I give it full width imagery and smaller chunks of text to read. And I might glance at that and think, you know what, I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now you can think about this, how this might play out if I'm talking about deciding whether or not to drive or use public transportation. If I use that printed schedule, I am convinced public transportation is impossible. I will never use it. If I take one look at that app screen, before I've even read a word, I might conclude, you know what, I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see all of your faces, so I'm just gonna ask you to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? So typically people, so first off, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913. A few days ago, actually, was her birthday. But people tend to pick 1914 because if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, part of what's happening here is we like things that are easy to process. One of the things that I've learned is that a lot of bias is really just us trying to find shortcuts to certainty. We love certainty and we hate uncertainty. And we will throw logic and other people under the bus to get to certainty. And things that are easy to process feel more certain. And I'll give you an example. Let's say I asked you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel very certain about that answer. It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. If I say, well, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Answer comes right away. Feels very certain. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that use big, bold fonts and clear imagery and clear language, easier to process, feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when the knowledge is something that needs to be believed. There is a crisis in this country where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In 2002, when given the statement that the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%.
Wow.
We do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons that African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me and said, okay, that sounds interesting in theory, but can you point to actual instances where plain language and pictograms have saved lives? And I'm glad she did, because I found some really interesting stuff. So this is a situation where you had women who were smoking while pregnant. And when they were given materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, you saw they were more likely to quit smoking during pregnancy and even 6 weeks postpartum. If you take a look at folks who are helping other people take their medication, caregivers, and they had a plain language pictogram-based intervention, you saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medication. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. Not too long ago, a whole bunch of different states start rolling out legislation that say, if you don't wear your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did a lot of good, especially among older drivers, but not as much among younger drivers. And so they rolled out click it or ticket. And the results were that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, for every percentage point you go up in somebody wearing their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So rough math, that's 4,000 lives saved, in part through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. Now, this whole easy to process thing even extends to names, right? There's literally a name pronunciation effect, where if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture that you're in, you tend to do better. This can affect things like voting preferences and your occupational status. Now, with the caveat that easy to pronounce is culturally sensitive, right? In some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In other cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, you got it made. They looked at law firms. This is my favorite part of it. They looked at law firms, and the higher up you went in the hierarchy of the law firm, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks, right? So if you have like an IPO, if the name of your company, the name of your stock is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. In fact, if even the little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. So we will lay down real money on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out pretty innocently. Let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. And next to it, you see a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing, but I framed one to seem more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I said, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are multilingual, which I heard some of you are, you actually have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you actually are more likely to see through the scam. Now, I speak a little bit of French. And so if I think about the beef decision in French, that would go something like, okay, beef, that's beef, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, 89, maybe, right? And by the time I've done all that processing, I see right through the scam. And that's the point. I've slowed down my thinking. Most biases, those shortcuts are happening when we're in a rush, we're in a hurry, there's a deadline, we got stuff to do, right? When we can slow down our thinking and use what Daniel Kahneman calls system two thinking, right? That's reserved for like really tough math equations, right? If we can slow down our thinking, we're less likely to fall for a lot of these biases. Now you can actually use the framing effect for good. So there's an experiment where you have a photo like this and you show it to an audience and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a policy discussion. You'll have some people saying, oh, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And you'll have other people saying, oh, how dare you, that's ageist, people should do what they want. And all you're gonna learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the exact same photo to another audience and ask them, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is a design discussion, right? Some people will say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that discussion is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I iris out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. This even extends to colleges where you have student evaluations of teachers. This is another area where women and people of color are disadvantaged. They tend to be rated lower than their white male counterparts for the courses they teach, even if it's the same course. So Iowa State University did an experiment where they said, okay, let's give some of these students a couple paragraphs to frame that survey, right? And the paragraphs basically said, hey, exactly that, right? This is an area where women tend to be disadvantaged. Please, when you are making your evaluation, focus on real criteria and not things like appearance. The students who got those 2 paragraphs tended to rate their female professors higher than the students who did not. Now, I want to close by talking about our cognitive biases because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. Let's talk about notational bias. You can see this play out in sheet music. So I grew up playing saxophone, and so I had to learn to read music that looked like this, right? And I came to understand that any music in the world, you could write it down like this and then I could play it. But that's just not true. There's lots of Asian and African music for which this system of notation just doesn't work. But if this is the standard, it is remarkably easy to erase lots of different cultures. You can see this play out when we ask for personal information, right? If I have it in my head that there's only 2 genders and I write my forms that way, I'm going to eradicate any number of identities. While we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about the self-serving bias. Now, this is a bias where if something goes right, that's my fault. If something goes wrong, that's your fault. You may have encountered this bias in your life. But this plays out for people and computers too. Generally speaking, if I'm doing something on a computer and something goes wrong, I will blame the computer. If something goes right, I will blame me. Unless I've given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame myself if something goes wrong and the computer if something goes right. So we need to be very thoughtful how often we ask for personal information. Do we really need it? Because the more we do it, the more we are potentially engendering an unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. This plays out in structured content all the time. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. So the way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would say her full name. And then every mention after that, you'd either say Miss last name or Mrs. last name. And the pattern this sets up, and remember how important patterns are. The pattern this sets up is that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married. Then maybe her last name, right? Now picture that in article after article for over 100 years. We need to be very careful how we structure content, what kind of editorial guidelines we set up, because that is a very easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. Back in the day, you have Vice President Dick Cheney basically trying to figure out what he can get away with. So he talks to his lawyers and they tell him, okay, look, you are the vice president, which means you are a member of the executive branch. But you cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you're also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be a part of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. We see the same thing play out today with software like Facebook, right? When it suits them, Facebook says, we are a publisher. Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out there are rules for publishers, it's all, I don't know what you heard, buddy. We're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us think how to write more inclusively. One of them is Radical Copy Editor. And I'll send out a PDF later with a link to just all of the resources I'm mentioning, so you don't have to try to scribble any of this down. But Radical Copy Editor is really good at helping you think about how to write about folks who don't usually get a lot of say in how they're written about. Another good one is Textio. And it's really good for writing like inclusive job descriptions because not everybody wants to be a rock star or a ninja. Another term we should get familiar with is evidentiality. And it's something that English doesn't really have, but some other languages do. And it has to do with verb tense, right? So English uses verb tense mostly to tell you when something happened, right? Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Other languages make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting. Languages like Turkish. And there, the verb tense is there to tell you how I know that something happened, right? How I know that Bob went to the store. So there is one verb tense for I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's another verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store, and a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. The point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know that Bob went to the store. Now think about how that would affect what people were willing to post, what people were willing to say in a speech if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English lacks this as a mandatory feature, but I think we can get creative about how to introduce it. So remember how I said that if something is easier to read, it feels more true. Well, it works in the reverse as well. If something is harder to read, it doesn't feel as true. So this is an article from when the first teaser trailer for the new 007 film came out. And the first paragraph is confirmable information, right? This is the name of the movie. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director got fired. First paragraph is fairly easy to read, fairly easy to believe. Second paragraph, a little harder to read, a little harder to believe, and it should be, it's a rumor. So I think we can start to get creative about how to signal to our users how many grains of salt they should be taking some of their content with. Told you we'd come back to this. So for a long time, I really misunderstood the scientific method. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. And if I get a good result, I'm going to write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. If they get the same result, great. Let's write it down. It's a law. Let's move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. I have an idea about how the world works. I am going to test my idea. If I get a good result, I'm going to write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. If they get the same result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. Now, that is a much more rigorous approach, and it was invented specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, as writers, it is remarkably easy for us to leave more elegant solutions on the table because we fall in love with our initial idea. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with a computer. And the computer is going to show us those numbers and a question mark and say, put whatever number you want where the question mark is, and I will tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you are ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, the first number you try is 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. Pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that comes before it, which is a more elegant solution, probably easier to code, or probably cheaper to build. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are tools out there to help us avoid this outcome. One of them is called Red Team, Blue Team. And it's something that both the military and journalists use. And I love saying that because how many things can you say that about? But the basic idea is you have a blue team who does the initial research, maybe gets as far as a wireframe. But before they go any further, you have a red team come in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every more elegant solution, every hidden bias, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical. I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, from now on, we've got to spin up 2 teams for every project and they got to check each other's work every day. No, I need 1 team for 1 day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Now, one of the things I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of an outside perspective. This is Norman Ohler. He wrote a book called Blitzed about Nazis on drugs. And the way it started is Norman has a DJ friend who grew up in Munich and said, hey, when I was growing up in Munich, all of the World War II vets would talk about how they were on drugs all the time. And Norman takes his friend at his word and does some research. And sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. Here's the doses they were giving. They were basically giving the soldiers meth. Here's what they were giving Hitler. It was basically oxy. And then here's what they were giving the German populace at the time. Now, all of this information was there, and World War II is not what I would call an obscure conflict. I'd say there's a lot of scholarship on World War II, but no one had stumbled upon this. My theory is that the Venn diagram of historians and folks who are familiar with recreational drug use is fairly thin. And if our DJ friend had approached a historian and said, hey, did you know that the Nazis were on drugs? Most historians would be like, okay, whatever, junkie. But Norman was familiar with recreational drug use, as was his DJ friend, and was willing to take these things at their word. The point is, if you were to ask me, Dave, we're writing a book about World War II, who should we get? My first answer wouldn't be, oh, I know, a German DJ. But it would be a great answer. So we need to start thinking about what outside perspectives can bring us. Part of the challenge around like thinking about these negative outcomes, right, is that we are used to, when we are designing things, right, selling the happy path. Like, we're going to make your app so much better. We're going to make your website so much better. Here's all the cool things people will be able to do. We think about all the happy paths we're creating without really thinking about the unhappy paths, right? Because anyone who's ever tried to design anything knows, or anyone who's ever written an error message knows, there's a lot more that can go wrong than can go right. But there's a bias that stands in the way of us really thinking deeply about unhappy paths, and it's called survivorship bias. And you can see this play out in the story of Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a brilliant mathematician who lived in Austria in the 1930s, but he was a Jewish mathematician who lived in Austria in the 1930s. And so his life was in danger. He managed to get out and get to the States. And when he got there, the armed services asked him to help them out. And one of the problems they were trying to solve was, how do we keep our planes from getting shot down? So they had a room full of planes with bullet holes in them and scientists who were looking at these planes, and Army was asking them, hey, where do we arm these planes so they don't get shot down so much? And a lot of the scientists looked at the planes and said, well, clearly where you see these bullet holes, put more armament there. And our friend Abraham takes one look at that and says, actually, you need to put armament exactly where you don't see the bullet holes. Because Abraham realized they were looking at the planes that made it back. They needed to worry about the planes that were shot so bad they never made it back. And clearly, those were shot someplace else. The people in the room were looking at the survivors. They weren't thinking about the ones that weren't so lucky. And that's how we get when we design. We kind of like to think about the happy path. We don't like to think about the ones who aren't so lucky. Now, a really good tool for this is called Speculative Design. And it's a lot like the show Black Mirror, which, if you've never seen it, is kind of a twilight zone for tech. You take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real human beings got their hands on it. And it's always terrible. I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is a real job. Superflux went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them think about the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we stay down the road of fossil fuels, or should we start investing in renewables? So what Superflux did was they tried to figure out, okay, what is your air quality going to be like 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out if you stay on the road of fossil fuels? But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it. And then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to about 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another tool you can use at the beginning of a project to kind of get all your biases onto the table is called an assumption audit. And the basic idea is you get your team in the room before you begin the project, and you ask these 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent? And you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're going to think about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity. And then you're going to ask, how might those identities influence the outcome of this thing we're working on? And then you ask, who's not in the room, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? And then you ask, how might the absence of those perspectives affect the outcome of this experience? And then you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those perspectives in our process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, certainly, talk to people. Honor, maybe pay them for their time. Give power, right? Are there people who are going to be impacted by what we're working on who have no say in what we're working on? And is there a way to give them a say because they're going to have to live with the thing we're building? Now, a really fun example of this, for those of you who watch The Mandalorian, is you have this, sci-fi TV show, and you have this race of aliens who speak mostly in sign language. And one of the people working on the crew, who knew ASL, said, hey, I actually know someone who's deaf and might be able to work on this. And they actually cast him as one of the sound people, and they helped develop this alien language and made it feel very authentic. And I love what he says here. It's our responsibility when we're in the room to look around and see who's missing. He saw who was missing, and it made the show better. Now, when we're trying to figure out of all the different people who aren't in the room, which ones should we really be focusing on? A really good filter is power. Ask yourself who does and doesn't have power in the process. And this is from an approach called Participatory Design. And you start out by thinking about how power plays out in the thing you're working on. And this is a power map. It's one of the first things you can do when you're working on a design. And you basically map out from low interest to high interest, right? Who doesn't really have a lot of interest, who isn't really impacted by this, and who is really impacted. But then also power, who doesn't have a lot of say in how this goes, and who has a lot of say in how this goes, right? And what you're looking for are those folks in that lower quadrant who are really going to be impacted by this thing, but don't really have a lot of say in how it's going to turn out. So an example might be if a government design agency is working with that city's Office of Homeless Services. It's based on a true story, actually. So let's say they are redesigning the intake process for that office. The people who are going to be impacted by this a lot, but don't really have any power, are the people experiencing homelessness. And maybe a little bit higher up from that might be the frontline staff who are helping those people with those services. Participatory design then becomes about how do we take those people who are in that lower quadrant and give them more power, moving them up to that higher quadrant. And it involves things like saying, yeah, we're going to research with folks, but instead of saying, okay, we've done your interview and move on, well, no, we're going to come back. And when we've synthesized our research, we're going to ask you, did we get this right? And then when we design, we're going to co-design with you. And before we release the design, we're going to say, hey, did we get this right? And finally, before anything gets implemented, you're going to be the final judge. And we're going to ask you, hey, before we release this thing that you're going to have to live with, did we get this right? Because again, they're the ones who are going to have to live with it. The final bias I want to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. And it is a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job. And in the workaholic world we live in, that might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The folks who ran Princess Di off the road that night, the paparazzi, probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were, right? They were getting really difficult to get photographs that they were going to get a lot of money for. What they were not doing a good job of was being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner, a guy named Ramsey of Philadelphia, asked his officers when he got the job, he asked his officers all the same question. What do you think your job is? And many of them answered to enforce the law. And he would tell them, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I've had this slide in here since I first gave this talk years ago. And obviously in the past year and even still today, it has a lot more visibility and it's more visceral, and I get more emotional than I used to when I showed this slide, but I keep it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Now, Ramsey was telling his officers that day that their jobs were harder than they think. And I submit to us, our jobs are harder than we think. It's not just create cool stuff. We have to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are folks already working on this. Mike Montero out at Mule Design has got a little book of design ethics that's kind of like a Hippocratic oath, a first do no harm for designers. And it's full of wisdom, like a designer is first and foremost a human being, right? You have the Design Justice Network, who is doing amazing work in this area. And they have a list of 10 principles. I'm just going to read you the first 2. 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcome of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first 2, you have got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're doing the latter. One of the things that honestly gives me hope is that the ways of thinking we need to get through some of these problems have existed for millennia. The practice of ethics and moral philosophy, people have been thinking about this stuff really hard for a very long time. It's just a question of actually applying that thinking to today. The Mercola Center for Applied Ethics has done some great work in this area to kind of distill some of that millennia-old knowledge into practical questions you can ask about the work you're doing. So which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtue approach, right? This knowledge has been there for millennia. It's just a question of having the will to use it. I would also recommend just watching all of The Good Place. Another great tool for this is called the Tarot Cards of Tech. And it's this great interaction where you go to the website and they give you these cards to click on. And when you click on them, they flip around and give you these really provocative questions about the product you're working on. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits, right? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might have a very different world today. You also have data scientists and software engineers getting in on this. You have the Never Again pledge, which came out when a lot of data scientists were being asked to use their work in a way that would hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a very long and sordid history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that history. In fact, here's a list of things that we will do to make sure that doesn't happen, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. And this kind of collective action is even playing out at places like Google, where you had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And when the folks working on it realized, what it was, they were like, look, we didn't get into this business to make weapons. So if you make us work on this, we're out. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the military. And then they turned right around and did Project Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. But this battle rages on. Now, if you're thinking, hey, I would love to kind of, get in on this and find ways to do work more ethically, to try to incorporate some of these, but, that's a lot. Where do I start? I recommend using consistency bias. So an example might be, instead of saying, hey, we're going to roll out a totally new inclusive design platform, and we're going to create the inclusive design committee, and we're going to figure out how to completely transform every single aspect of how we design at this company, you're basically creating a meeting engine. Instead, focus on just saying, hey, this next project we're working on, it's about 100 hours, right? Could I get just 2 of those hours for an assumption audit? Because that's about how long an assumption audit takes, right? Can I get just 2 of those hours for an assumption audit, right? And have that happen a couple times and get some good feedback on it, and then come back and say, well, you know what? Those assumption audits were pretty good. This next project, it's about 100 days, right? Can I get just 1 of those days for a red team, blue team? Now you've gone from asking for a couple hours to a whole day, but it seems more reasonable. And the reason is consistency bias. Consistency bias, a good example is if I go up to you and I say, hey, can I put this big honking sign on your lawn? You're probably going to say no. But if I come up to you and I say, can I put this tiny, you won't even notice it. Just this tiny little sign. Can I put it? You're more likely to say yes. If I come back a couple of weeks later and then I ask, hey, can I put this big honking sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes because you're sign people now. We like to be consistent with our former decisions. Same thing with inclusive design. Hey, can I get this just a little 2-hour meeting? Just no one will, just a little tiny, great. Okay, come back a few projects later. Hey, can I get a whole day? Well, I guess we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's more true today. So the question I will leave all of us with is, how might we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Let's stop the recording.